In times of desperation, even the most unlikely weapon can become the last shield between freedom and invasion. Continental Europe had fallen. The thunder of German panzers had rolled across Poland, France, Belgium, and the Netherlands with terrifying efficiency. The Blitzkrieg had proven unstoppable. Britain stood alone, an island fortress staring across the Channel at an enemy that seemed invincible. The threat was not abstract. It was immediate, tangible, measured in the distance a bomber could fly or a tank could roll onto English soil. In the war rooms of Whitehall, military strategists faced a nightmare scenario. If German forces launched Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain, how would British infantry stop the advance of armored divisions? The boy's anti-tank rifle, the standard issue weapon, was already obsolete. German tank armor had grown thicker. The weapon that was supposed to protect the home front could barely scratch the paint of a Panzer III. The question echoed through the corridors of power with the urgency of a ticking clock. What could a British soldier carry on his back that might stop a 30-ton machine of war? The answer would come not from the grand factories of industrial might, but from the mind of a single military engineer who understood that sometimes the most effective weapon is not the most sophisticated, but the one that simply works when everything else has failed. Major Millis Jeffress was not a typical weapons designer. He was an officer in the Royal Engineers who had spent years thinking about unconventional warfare. While others focused on refinement and precision, Jeffress concerned himself with practicality and improvisation. He had already made his mark developing specialized weapons for commando operations. Now, in 1941, he turned his attention to the most urgent problem facing British infantry: tank defense. The challenge was brutal in its simplicity. Create a weapon that an ordinary soldier could carry, make it powerful enough to penetrate modern tank armor, ensure it could be manufactured quickly with limited resources, and do all of this while Britain was fighting for its survival, with factories bombed nightly and raw materials desperately scarce. Jeffress worked at the Firs, a secret research facility in Whitchurch, Buckinghamshire. The location was deliberately obscure, a country estate converted into a weapons laboratory where unconventional ideas were not just welcomed, but required. Here, alongside a small team of engineers and ordnance experts, Jeffress began sketching what would become one of the war's most distinctive infantry weapons. The design philosophy was radical. Instead of firing a projectile with conventional propellant, the weapon would use a powerful spring mechanism, essentially a giant crossbow principle applied to anti-tank warfare. The projectile would be a hollow charge bomb, using shaped explosive technology to focus blast energy into a superheated jet capable of burning through armor plate. It was ungainly. It was heavy. It looked like something cobbled together in a desperate workshop, but on paper, it could work. By late 1942, after months of testing, modification, and refinement, the weapon received its official designation: Projector, Infantry, Anti-Tank. The acronym was inevitable. Soldiers would call it the PIAT. The PIAT was unlike anything in any army's arsenal. At first glance, it appeared almost medieval, a crude tube mounted on a shoulder rest, with a massive spring mechanism visible through the weapon's frame. It weighed 32 pounds when loaded, making it one of the heaviest infantry weapons of the war. Carrying it required strength. Using it required courage. The operating principle was deceptively simple. A powerful coil spring, compressed with tremendous force, would launch a finned projectile at approximately 300 feet per second. The projectile itself, a 2.5-pound hollow charge bomb, would detonate on impact, creating a focused jet of molten metal and explosive force capable of penetrating up to 100 millimeters of armor plate. But simplicity in concept did not mean simplicity in operation. Loading the PIAT was a physical ordeal. The operator had to place the weapon on the ground, put one foot in the shoulder rest for leverage, and pull back the cocking mechanism with both hands using all available body weight. The spring required approximately 200 pounds of force to compress. Some soldiers reported that they could not cock the weapon at all. Others developed specific techniques, lying on their backs, using legs for leverage, working in pairs. Once cocked, The PIAT was ready to fire. The operator would load a bomb into the trough at the front of the weapon, shoulder the device, aim using the crude metal sights, and pull the trigger. The spring would release with a violent jolt. The weapon would slam backward with brutal recoil. The bomb would sail through the air in a high, arcing trajectory. Effective range was approximately 100 yards. Beyond that, accuracy became hopeless. The slow projectile velocity meant enemy tanks had time to spot the launch and take evasive action. The high trajectory required the operator to aim well above the target, making quick shooting nearly impossible. And yet, despite these limitations, the PIAT had one extraordinary advantage. It produced almost no flash and very little noise compared to conventional anti-tank weapons. A soldier could fire from concealment and remain hidden. In urban warfare, in hedgerows, in close-quarters combat, this stealth characteristic made the PIAT exceptionally dangerous. The hollow-charge warhead was equally revolutionary. Unlike armor-piercing rounds that relied on kinetic energy and hardness, the shaped charge worked through physics and chemistry. Upon impact, the copper cone at the warhead's tip would collapse inward, creating a jet of superheated metal traveling at hypersonic speeds. This jet could burn through armor regardless of the projectile's velocity. It was the great equalizer, a relatively slow-moving bomb that could destroy the fastest, most heavily armored tank. Production began in 1943. By war's end, over 115,000 PIATs had been manufactured. British factories, Canadian arsenals, and workshops across the Commonwealth churned them out. They were issued to infantry battalions, airborne units, and home defense forces. They became standard kit. The PIAT was ready for war. The war was ready for the PIAT. The PIAT's combat debut came not in the grand set-piece battles of military legend, but in the desperate, close-quarters fighting that defined much of World War II's deadliest engagements. North Africa, 1943. British infantry in Tunisia encountered German armor during the final push to eliminate Axis forces from the continent. In the rocky terrain and narrow wadis, PIATs proved surprisingly effective. Soldiers discovered that the weapon's high trajectory, so problematic in open country, worked perfectly when firing over walls, rocks, and earthen berms. The bombs would drop onto the thinner top armor of tanks, exactly where they were most vulnerable. After-action reports began filtering back to command. The PIAT, dismissed by some as a makeshift desperation weapon, was getting kills. But the true test would come in Italy. The Italian campaign was a meat grinder. Mountain warfare, urban combat, river crossings under fire, all against a determined enemy fighting from prepared positions. At Anzio, during the desperate beachhead battles of early 1944, PIATs became essential. German counterattacks with tanks and self-propelled guns ran into infantry armed with the awkward spring guns. In the ruins of farmhouses and the maze of drainage ditches, British soldiers would wait until the last possible moment, then rise and fire at point-blank range. The psychological impact was significant. German tank crews learned to fear the distinctive silhouette of a PIAT operator. The lack of muzzle flash meant the first warning of danger might be the explosion of a hollow-charge warhead against their hull. Tanks began avoiding close combat with British infantry. They requested infantry support more frequently. They advanced more cautiously. The weapon had become a threat. June 6, 1944. Normandy. Among the thousands of soldiers wading ashore through the surf and machine gun fire, PIAT teams carried their weapons wrapped in waterproof covers. The 32-pound burden seemed impossible as men struggled through chest-deep water, weighed down by equipment, exhausted before the battle even began. Many PIATs were lost in the landing, dropped, abandoned, sunk in the channel. But the ones that made it ashore would prove their worth. In the bocage country of Normandy, the infamous hedgerow terrain that turned every field into a miniature fortress, the PIAT became indispensable. The close-quarters fighting played to every one of the weapon's strengths. British and Canadian infantry would wait in hedgerows as German armor approached. The tanks, confined to narrow lanes, unable to maneuver, became perfect targets. On June 7th, in Noray-en-Bessin, a PIAT team knocked out a Panther tank at close range. The hollow charge warhead penetrated the frontal armor, a feat that should have been impossible. The crew abandoned the vehicle. British troops seized it, and propaganda officers made certain the story spread through the ranks. If a PIAT could kill a Panther, it could kill anything. Throughout the summer of 1944, as Allied forces fought through France, Belgium, and into the Netherlands, PIAT teams accumulated an impressive tally. Records from British and Canadian units showed dozens of confirmed tank kills, plus countless more damaged vehicles and self-propelled guns knocked out of action. One incident stands above the rest. Arnhem, September 1944. Operation Market Garden. British paratroopers of the 1st Airborne Division were surrounded, cut off, fighting against overwhelming German forces, including SS Panzer divisions. The battle was already lost, but the men at the bridge refused to surrender. Among them was Major Robert Kane, commanding a company that held a crucial position against repeated German armor attacks. Kane operated a PIAT personally, directing fire, loading weapons, and engaging German tanks at suicidal range. Over the course of several days, he knocked out or damaged multiple armored vehicles. When the PIAT bombs ran out, he fought with other weapons. When those ran out, he continued directing his men. He was wounded, partially deafened by explosions, and still refused to leave his position. For his actions at Arnhem, Robert Kane received the Victoria Cross, Britain's highest military honor. It was the only VC awarded to an airborne soldier during the entire war. The citation specifically mentioned his use of the PIAT against overwhelming odds. The weapon had proven itself not just effective, but worthy of the men who carried it. As Allied forces pushed into Germany in 1945, the PIAT found its perfect battleground: cities. In the rubble-strewn streets of German towns, among the shattered buildings and blocked roads, conventional anti-tank warfare became nearly impossible. Visibility was measured in yards. Ambush was everywhere. German defenders used the terrain brilliantly, positioning armor in hull-down positions, covering every approach. The PIAT teams adapted. They learned to fire from upper floors, dropping bombs onto tanks passing below. They fired through windows, from basements, from behind barricades of rubble. The weapon's lack of backblast, unlike the American bazooka or German Panzerschreck, meant it could be fired from enclosed spaces without killing the operator. A PIAT team could hide inside a building, fire through a small opening, and remain concealed. German forces began to dread urban combat against British infantry. The PIAT had become synonymous with sudden, devastating attack from unexpected angles. Tank commanders kept their hatches closed, limiting visibility. They moved faster, more recklessly, trying to avoid presenting stationary targets. In the crossing of the Rhine and the final push across Germany, PIATs continued their work. The number of enemy vehicles destroyed is impossible to calculate with precision. Records were incomplete, battles chaotic, victories uncounted in the rush to finish the war. But when the shooting stopped in May 1945, the PIAT had compiled a combat record that surprised everyone, including the officers who had initially dismissed it as a stopgap measure. While the PIAT was designed for European warfare, it saw limited but significant use in the Pacific. British and Commonwealth forces fighting in Burma carried PIATs against Japanese armor. The weapon proved effective against the lighter Japanese tanks, often destroying them with a single shot. In the dense jungle terrain, where visibility was severely limited and combat occurred at close range, the PIAT's characteristics were well suited to the conditions. Australian forces in the Southwest Pacific also used PIATs, though less frequently than other theaters. The primary enemy in jungle warfare was infantry, and the PIAT's weight made it less practical for troops operating in exhausting heat and difficult terrain. Nevertheless, when Japanese armor did appear, the PIAT teams were ready. Several documented instances exist of PIATs destroying Japanese tanks in Burma and New Guinea, adding to the weapon's impressive combat resume. Victory in Europe did not mean retirement for the PIAT. The weapon remained in British service well into the 1950s. As the British Empire transitioned into a post-war world, PIATs were issued to forces engaged in counterinsurgency operations, colonial conflicts, and Cold War tensions. In Palestine, during the British Mandate period from 1945 to 1948, PIATs were used by British forces in urban security operations. When the State of Israel was established, both Israeli and Arab forces acquired PIATs from various sources. The weapon saw action in the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, used by both sides in the desperate fighting. During the Malayan Emergency, the British counterinsurgency campaign against communist guerrillas from 1948 to 1960, PIATs were issued to units operating in jungle terrain. While rarely used in their intended anti-tank role, they proved effective as bunker busters and demolition tools. The hollow charge warhead could destroy fortified positions and clear obstacles. The Korean War saw limited PIAT use by British Commonwealth forces. By this time, however, the weapon was clearly obsolescent. More modern anti-tank weapons had emerged. The American 3.5-inch Super Bazooka offered better range and easier operation. The British were developing their own next-generation weapons. By the mid-1950s, the PIAT was quietly withdrawn from frontline service. It remained in reserve stocks and territorial army units for several more years, but the era of the spring-powered anti-tank weapon had passed. Despite its crude appearance and difficult operation, the PIAT represented genuine innovation in weapons design. The hollow charge warhead principle, refined through PIAT development, became standard in modern anti-tank weapons. Today's shoulder-fired missiles, from the American Javelin to the Swedish AT-4, all use shaped charge technology descended from World War II research. The concept of a low-signature infantry anti-tank weapon influenced post-war design. The PIAT's minimal flash and noise demonstrated the tactical value of stealth in infantry operations. Modern weapons continue to emphasize reduced signatures to keep operators concealed. Interestingly, the spring launch principle, so unusual in the PIAT, reappeared decades later in non-lethal weapons. Some modern grenade launchers and less lethal projectile systems use spring or compressed air propulsion, avoiding the flash, noise, and danger of chemical propellants. The PIAT also taught military planners important lessons about weapons procurement. It demonstrated that even difficult-to-use weapons could be effective if they met critical battlefield needs. It showed that unconventional designs deserved consideration, and it proved that desperation could produce innovation when conventional approaches failed. Beyond the technical specifications and combat statistics, the PIAT was defined by the men who carried it. Soldiers had mixed feelings about the weapon. Many cursed its weight, its brutal recoil, its difficult cocking mechanism. Physical fitness standards had to be adjusted because not all soldiers could operate it effectively. Training accidents occurred. Fingers were smashed, shoulders dislocated, backs strained. And yet, interviews with veterans reveal a grudging respect. The PIAT worked. When a tank approached and you had a PIAT, you had a chance. That chance might require getting dangerously close. It might require exposing yourself to enemy fire. But it existed. Veterans recall the distinctive sound of the PIAT firing, a dull thump, nothing like the crack of conventional weapons. They remember the wobbling flight of the bomb, seeming to float through the air in slow motion. They remember the sharp explosion when it struck home, and the satisfaction of watching a tank grind to a halt, smoke pouring from its hatches. Some soldiers personalized their PIATs with nicknames, painted messages, or good luck charms. Units developed unofficial expertise, with certain soldiers known as particularly skilled PIAT operators. Techniques were shared, tricks passed down, the best way to brace for recoil, how to estimate range, when to fire and when to wait. The weapon bonded crews together. Loading a PIAT under fire required trust. One man exposing himself to cock the weapon while another provided covering fire. Teams that worked well together became more effective, more dangerous. For German soldiers, the PIAT acquired a fearsome reputation. Captured documents and post-war interviews reveal that German troops considered British infantry particularly dangerous in close terrain, specifically because of the PIAT. The weapon's unpredictability, its silent launch, its ability to fire from enclosed spaces, its deadly warhead, made every engagement with British troops a nerve-wracking experience. The PIAT existed alongside other Allied anti-tank weapons, each with distinct characteristics. The American M1 bazooka, introduced in 1942, used a rocket-propelled grenade with a shaped charge warhead. It was lighter than the PIAT, had better range, and was far easier to operate. However, the bazooka produced a massive backblast that revealed the operator's position and made firing from enclosed spaces deadly to the crew. The later M9 Super Bazooka, introduced in 1943 with a larger 3.5-inch warhead, offered even better performance. American soldiers generally preferred their bazookas to the PIAT, and comparison tests supported this preference in most battlefield conditions. The German Panzerschreck, essentially a scaled-up copy of the captured American bazooka, was perhaps the most effective infantry anti-tank weapon of the war. It combined excellent range, powerful warhead, and relative ease of use. However, like the bazooka, it produced enormous backblast and was difficult to conceal. The PIAT's advantage remained its stealth and its ability to fire from confined spaces. In hedgerows, urban combat, and defensive positions, these characteristics often outweighed the superior range and handling of rocket-propelled weapons. Soviet forces used primarily anti-tank rifles and RPG-43 handheld-shaped charge grenades for infantry anti-armor work. These weapons required even closer approach than the PIAT, making them extremely dangerous to use but effective in Soviet offensive tactics. Each weapon reflected its nation's tactical doctrine, industrial capabilities, and battlefield priorities. The PIAT was quintessentially British, unconventional, difficult, effective despite its limitations, and born from necessity rather than long-term planning. The PIAT entered British military culture in ways that transcended its tactical role. Veterans organizations preserved PIATs as memorials. Museums displayed them alongside testimonies from men who had carried them. Military historians debated their effectiveness, with arguments continuing decades after the war. In popular culture, the PIAT appeared in films, television shows, and literature about World War II. It became a visual shorthand for British infantry, the distinctive shape instantly recognizable to audiences. War movies would invariably include a scene of a PIAT team engaging enemy armor, usually at dramatic close range. Military collectors sought PIATs for private collections. Deactivated examples became valuable, with prices increasing as veterans aged and original weapons became scarcer. Museums around the Commonwealth acquired specimens for permanent display. The weapon even inspired modern firearms designers. Several contemporary weapons show clear conceptual lineage from the PIAT's hollow charge technology and infantry portable design philosophy. Measured purely by numbers, the PIAT's impact is difficult to quantify precisely. Estimates suggest that PIATs destroyed or damaged over 500 enemy armored vehicles during World War II. The true number is certainly higher. Many kills were never officially recorded, occurred during chaotic combat where documentation was impossible, or were shared credit with other weapons. But raw statistics miss the broader impact. The PIAT gave British and Commonwealth infantry confidence. It provided psychological comfort, the knowledge that they possessed a weapon capable of stopping enemy armor. In an army that often felt under-equipped compared to German forces, the PIAT represented parity, however imperfect. The weapon influenced German tactical doctrine. Tank units modified their approaches, requested more infantry support, and avoided situations where PIATs would be most effective. This indirect impact, forcing enemy adaptation, may have been as valuable as the direct destruction of vehicles. In the strategic context of World War II, the PIAT served its purpose admirably. It was available when needed, in sufficient quantities, at a time when Britain could afford neither delay nor failure. It bridged the gap between obsolete pre-war weapons and more sophisticated post-war systems. No soldier would call the PIAT perfect. No engineer would argue it represented the pinnacle of weapons design. But perfection was never the requirement. The requirement was survival, defense, and eventually victory. The PIAT met that requirement. Today, the PIAT exists primarily in museums, collections, and the fading memories of elderly veterans. The weapons themselves, those that survive, rest in display cases with plaques explaining their history. They look crude, almost primitive, compared to modern anti-tank missiles with laser guidance, tandem warheads, and fire-and-forget capability. But to dismiss the PIAT as obsolete misses its significance. It represents a moment when British ingenuity, resourcefulness, and determination produced a solution to an existential threat. It embodies the principle that victory does not always come from superior technology, but from the will to fight with whatever weapons are available. The men who carried PIATs are nearly gone now. Each year, fewer veterans remain to tell stories of the brutal recoil, the wobbling flight of bombs, the satisfaction of watching an enemy tank grind to a halt. Soon, no living memory will exist of what it felt like to cock that brutal spring, to shoulder that 32 pounds of metal, to aim at an approaching tank and pull the trigger. What will remain are the facts: 115,000 produced, service from 1943 to the 1950s, combat across Europe, North Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. Hundreds of enemy vehicles destroyed, countless lives saved because British infantry possessed a weapon that worked. The PIAT was never elegant, it was never perfect. But when Britain's shores needed defending, when soldiers needed a shield against armored invasion, the PIAT was there. And in the end, that was enough. In the crucible of total war, even the most ungainly weapon can become a tool of salvation, if held by hands brave enough to use it.